The dock creaked softly under my feet, the scent of pine and lake water clinging to the cool Vermont air. And for a moment, I let myself believe this weekend could still be good. The Carter family reunion was supposed to be about warmth and laughter, the kind of small-town magic you see in holiday postcards. A bonfire waiting to be lit, strings of amber bulbs swaying above picnic tables stacked with homemade pies, and the reflection of the full moon shimmering on still water. Around me, relatives chatted in small clusters, the clink of mason jar glasses blending with the hum of an old radio playing somewhere near the fire pit. But every time I caught Daniel's profile, the way his jaw tightened when I spoke, the way his eyes kept drifting toward Sophie, I felt a sharp little warning in my gut. If you've ever walked into a room and known in your bones something was about to change forever, you'll understand what I mean. And before I go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories reach. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest. Because, trust me, what happened that night still makes my hand shake when I talk about it. I'd driven 5 hours up from Boston, swollen ankles and all, because Daniel insisted we show up for family, and part of me wanted to believe him. After all, I was 8 months pregnant, and maybe, just maybe, this gathering would be the reset we needed. I wore the pale blue wrap dress my mother sent me in the mail, thinking it might make my eyes look softer, less tired. But as I crossed the lawn toward the porch where Daniel stood with Sophie, heads bent in too close conversation, I noticed Evelyn, his aunt, the only one in his family who's ever treated me like more than a placeholder, watching me from a rocking chair. She gave me the smallest nod, the kind that says, "Be ready for anything." Back then, I didn't know what she meant. Now, I wish I'd listened harder. Daniel barely looked up when I reached the porch, just handed me a glass of sparkling cider without meeting my eyes. Sophie's perfume, that syrupy vanilla she's worn since high school, clung to the air between us, making my stomach churn. We moved inside for dinner, the long farmhouse table groaning under roasted chicken, corn pudding, and every kind of pie Vermont could dream up. Evelyn slid into the seat across from me, her gaze flicking between Daniel and Sophie like she was keeping mental score. The conversations around us swelled and ebbed, the clink of silverware mixing with bursts of laughter, until Daniel suddenly stood, tapping his glass with the side of a fork. "Before dessert," he began, his voice carrying easily over the room, "there's something I need to share." For half a second, I thought maybe he'd planned a toast to our baby. My pulse actually quickened, foolishly, with hope. Then he reached into his blazer and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "Hannah," he said, his tone sharp as winter air, "I've filed for divorce, and I'll be petitioning for sole custody of our child." It was like the air in the room collapsed in on itself. Forks froze, mid-air. Someone at the far end whispered, "What?" Sophie's eyes shone with something that wasn't sympathy, and I swear I saw the corner of her mouth twitch upward. My throat closed so fast I could barely swallow. Daniel went on, weaving a story about my emotional instability, how I'd become paranoid and withdrawn these last months, carefully omitting that his late nights at the office began the week I told him I was pregnant. He even managed a fake sigh, as if this pained him. "It's not fair to bring a child into chaos," he told his family, like he was making some noble sacrifice. I could feel all those familiar eyes on me, measuring me, wondering if maybe he was right. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass until it creaked. I glanced at Evelyn. She didn't look shocked, just angry in a way that seemed older than both of us. The kind of anger that remembers. Daniel slid the envelope across the table toward me, like a dealer in a rigged game. I wanted to fling it in his face, but instead, I laid my hand on it, feeling the weight of what was inside. Not just legal papers, but a trap he'd been building for months. Around us, plates cooled, voices died, and the room became so still I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. My cheeks burned, my vision narrowed, and somewhere deep inside, something shifted. He thought this would break me here, in front of his whole family. But as the seconds stretched, I realized he'd just given me something else entirely. A reason to fight like I never had before. I don't remember much of dessert, only that Sophie accidentally took the chair closest to Daniel, her laugh cutting too brightly through the uneasy silence, and that no one seemed willing to meet my eyes except Evelyn. The envelope sat heavy in my lap like a hot coal I couldn't put down. I excused myself early, climbing the narrow stairs to the guest room at the far end of the hall, the old wood groaning under my weight. Inside, the space smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs, the kind of room meant for storage, not sanctuary. I shut the door, dropped the envelope on the bed, and just stood there, hands braced against the dresser, staring at my own reflection in the cracked mirror. My eyes looked unfamiliar, not just tired, but edged with something harder. I thought of all the little moments I'd brushed off these past months. Daniel taking my phone by mistake and keeping it all day. Sophie showing up at our house with grocery bags, but no reason. The way his mother had started calling less, except to ask if I was coping okay. The pieces clicked together now, sharp enough to cut. A soft knock broke the silence. Hannah? It was Evelyn's voice, low and careful. She slipped in without waiting for me to answer, closing the door behind her. "I've seen this before," she said, nodding toward the envelope. "A man who thinks he can script the ending before you even know the game's begun." She eased herself into the desk chair, crossing her legs with a deliberate calm that made me realize she was more than just the odd, warm aunt at family gatherings. "I used to practice law," she went on, "and Daniel, well, let's just say this isn't his first act of self-preservation at someone else's expense." My chest tightened. "He's been building a case," I said. She nodded. "And you're going to build a better one." From her bag, she pulled out a small notebook, a pen, and, to my surprise, a prepaid burner phone. "Call no one on your regular number. Not friends, not family, and especially not him. Start documenting. Dates, times, conversations. Get everything you can." For the next hour, we whispered like conspirators in the dim light, planning the first moves. I would call a private investigator Evelyn trusted, someone discreet. I would start photographing any documents left in the open, bills, bank statements, even stray Post-it notes. And I would keep my head down, no matter how much I wanted to lash out, because Daniel needed to believe his plan was working. When Evelyn finally left, I sat on the edge of the bed, turning the burner phone over in my hands. My daughter shifted inside me, a firm kick just beneath my ribs, and I pressed my palm there. "We're going to be okay," I whispered into the quiet. But even as I said it, I knew okay wasn't enough anymore. I wanted more: truth, justice, and the satisfaction of watching him realize He'd underestimated me from the very start. By morning, I'd memorized the creaks in the guest room floor, timing my steps so no one would hear me moving. Evelyn had already slipped out, leaving a folded note under my door. He's getting bolder. Stay invisible. Downstairs, the smell of strong coffee and frying bacon curled up the stairwell, and my stomach clenched, not from hunger, but from the thought of walking into that kitchen. I forced myself anyway, only to find Sophie perched on the counter in one of Daniel's hoodies, bare legs swinging like she owned the place. Daniel stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with the kind of domestic ease he hadn't shown me in months. "Morning," he said without looking at me, his voice smooth, practiced. Sophie smiled, all syrup and venom. "We saved you some coffee," she said, sliding a mug across the counter, the one I'd bought in Boston with my initials on it. I didn't touch it. Instead, I excused myself, claiming I had a headache, and headed back upstairs to call the private investigator on the burner phone. But halfway through explaining my situation, the line went dead. I checked the phone, no signal. Then I heard it, the faint click of the guest room door shutting. I stepped out into the hall just in time to see Daniel walking away, my laptop tucked under his arm. "Hey," I called after him. He turned, smiling faintly. "Your screen was cracked. I'll see if I can get it fixed." It wasn't cracked. We both knew it. The next few days blurred into a chess game I hadn't agreed to play. My bank app locked me out without warning. A set of printed medical forms, ones I'd never filled out, appeared on the dining room table, signed in shaky handwriting that looked uncomfortably like mine. Sophie spilled coffee across my only notebook when I left it unattended in the living room, murmuring an apology she didn't bother to fake. Evelyn kept her distance in public, but in passing, she'd brush my arm and mutter updates. "PI's in town. Don't break pattern. He's watching." The worst came 2 nights later, when I stepped out to the boathouse to get some air. The moon was bright enough to silver the lake, and the smell of damp rope and motor oil wrapped around me. I didn't hear Daniel until the door slammed shut behind me. He leaned against it, blocking the way. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice low, almost gentle. "Sign the papers. Let me handle things. You'll see your child on weekends, and we can keep it civil." My hand drifted toward the phone in my pocket, but his eyes caught the movement. "Careful," he murmured. "One wrong step, and you'll be the one they call unfit." I held his gaze, forcing my voice to stay steady. "I'm not afraid of you." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You should be." Then he stepped aside, opening the door like nothing had happened. The cold air hit me as I walked past him, but it wasn't enough to stop the heat building in my chest. He thought he'd boxed me in. He didn't know I was already mapping my way out, and straight into the moment that would undo him completely. The night of the bonfire arrived with a brittle chill that hinted winter wasn't far off. The Carters prided themselves on this tradition. One last lakeside gathering before everyone went back to their separate lives. Daniel was in his element, weaving through the crowd with a glass of bourbon, clapping his brothers on the back, and making sure everyone noticed Sophie's constant presence at his side. Evelyn had been quiet all day, but when I caught her eye across the yard, she gave me the smallest tilt of her head toward my tote bag, a silent reminder of what I was carrying inside it. As the flames climbed higher and sparks spiraled into the black sky, Daniel tapped his glass with a spoon. "Before we wrap up the weekend," he said, grinning like a man with no reason to fear, "I'd like to share a few updates about my future." I stepped forward before he could get another word out. "Actually," I said, loud enough that conversations faltered, "I have a few updates of my own." I set my toad on the picnic table, the zipper sounding louder than the crackle of the fire as I pulled out a thick folder. "Some of you have heard Daniel's version of our marriage," I began, meeting the eyes of his parents, his brothers, even Sophie. "But you haven't heard mine." I held up the first photo, Daniel and Sophie. Entering the back entrance of the Birchwood Inn on a Tuesday night, he'd told me he was closing a deal. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The next photo showed them at a hotel 2 towns over, hand in hand. Sophie's face drained of color. Daniel chuckled, the sound thin and tight. "This is ridiculous," he said, but I was already moving on. From the folder, I pulled bank statements, not just my own, but his. "This," I said, pointing to a transfer line, "is $3,000 from my trust account to Sophie's account. And this one, and this one." I flipped the pages, each dotted with red marker circles. In total, $64,000 transferred over the last 5 months, none of it with my consent. Gasps and low whistles rose from the group. "That's a lie," Daniel snapped, but his voice cracked. Evelyn stepped forward, hands clasped loosely in front of her. "The transfers are real," she said evenly, "and they're illegal." I could feel the shift then, the collective tilt of the crowd's sympathy away from him. I reached into the tote one last time and pulled out my burner phone. "And then there's this." I tapped the screen, and Daniel's voice spilled into the night, crystal clear. "Once the baby's here, we won't have to deal with her at all. The kid will be better off with us anyway." Sophie's voice followed. "You're sure she can't fight it?" And then, Daniel again. "Not with what I've documented. By the time I'm done, no one will believe her." The silence afterward was absolute. The kind that hums in your ears. Daniel's father took a step back from him, his mother's face hardening into something I'd never seen before. Sophie turned away, scanning for an escape that wasn't there. I closed the folder, slid the phone into my pocket, and let the words settle in the cold night air. "So, if we're sharing updates," I said, my voice steady now, "here's mine. My lawyer has already filed for emergency custody. The stolen funds are frozen. And this," I tapped the folder, "is only the beginning." And for the first time in months, Daniel didn't have a single thing to say. The bonfire crowd didn't linger after that. People drifted away in clusters, their whispers carrying just far enough for me to catch snatches. "Did you hear the recording? $64,000, can you believe it? And she's pregnant, for God's sake." Daniel stood rooted by the fire, jaw tight, as if willing the earth to swallow him whole. Sophie tried to slip off toward the driveway, but Evelyn intercepted her, voice low and firm. Whatever she said made Sophie blanch before hurrying to her car alone, headlights slicing through the dark as she sped away. Inside the house, Daniel's parents avoided my eyes, but when I passed them in the hallway, his mother murmured, "I didn't know." I wasn't sure if I believed her, but for the first time, there was no edge of superiority in her tone. By morning, the ripple effects had begun. Evelyn forwarded me an email from her old law partner confirming my emergency custody petition had been filed. A temporary freeze was placed on both Daniel's personal accounts and the joint ones he'd tried to drain. The PI sent over a compiled report, photos, bank trails, and a neat timeline of Daniel's affair and theft. More than enough for a solid case, Evelyn told me over coffee, her voice steady but warm. And enough to make him think twice about ever pulling this on someone else. 2 days later, news traveled faster than I expected. Daniel's real estate firm encouraged him to take an indefinite leave, which I knew meant they were cutting ties quietly to avoid the bad press. The local gossip chain lit up, not just about the affair, but about the money and the custody play. In a town like ours, reputations weren't ruined with one big blow. They eroded in 100 small ones. I heard from a neighbor that Daniel's brother refused to let him crash at his place. Even his own parents, embarrassed and exhausted, told him to sort himself out before coming around again. Meanwhile, Evelyn offered me her spare apartment over the garage in Burlington. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. A space with locks only I held the keys to. I accepted without hesitation. Moving out of that lake house was like shedding a skin I'd never asked to wear. With each box I packed, I felt the weight in my chest ease just a little. When the last load was done, I stood in the driveway, my daughter shifting inside me, and watched Daniel watch me from the porch. A silent figure framed by the house he thought would always be his stage. This time, I didn't look away first. 3 weeks later, I woke to sunlight spilling across the nursery walls. Pale yellow paint, soft cotton curtains swaying in the breeze from the open window. The apartment above Evelyn's garage had been transformed piece by piece. A secondhand rocking chair from the thrift store down the street, a crib my mother shipped from Boston, framed photos of places I'd loved before everything went wrong. It was small, but it felt safe, like the air inside knew my name. Evelyn came by most mornings, bringing coffee and a quiet smile. Never pushing, just being there. I'd learned that kind of presence was worth more than all the grand gestures Daniel had ever made. The court date for custody was still a week away, but my lawyer was confident. We had everything we needed: the recordings, the bank transfers, the PI's meticulous report. For once, I didn't feel the urge to rehearse every possible outcome. I knew the truth, and that was enough. Daniel hadn't contacted me directly since the night of the bonfire. Word was he'd moved into a rental above a bait shop near the highway, and Sophie had vanished from his life not long after. I didn't waste time wondering if he regretted anything. Regret was his problem to carry. One evening, I sat on the back steps with a mug of tea, the air crisp with the first hints of winter. Across the lake, the Carter family dock was just a dark outline now, empty and quiet. My daughter kicked, sharp and certain, and I pressed my hand against my belly, smiling at the reminder that life was moving forward, whether I looked back or not. I thought about the night on the dock when Daniel told me I should be afraid. How, for a moment, I almost believed him. And then I thought about standing in front of that bonfire, folder in hand, watching his confidence collapse in front of everyone he'd counted on to believe him. Loving the wrong person isn't failure, Evelyn had told me the day I moved in, but letting them define you is. Now, I understood. The real victory wasn't in humiliating him, though that moment had been sweet, but in taking back every piece of myself he'd tried to erode, in knowing I could stand on my own, not because I wanted to prove him wrong, but because I finally believed I could. As the sun dipped below the trees, the lake caught the last streaks of orange and gold, still and perfect. I leaned back, let the quiet fill me, and whispered to the little life inside me, "We're going to be just fine." And for the first time in a long time, I didn't just hope it, I knew it.